All right, well, welcome. Today is September 25th, and we are in kind of the middle of the first third of the Sermon on the Mount. We're going to be talking about Matthew 5:21 through 26 tonight. This is the first part where Jesus is going to get into several different things where he's going to say, "You've heard it said," and then he's going to counter that. But before I get started, if you are joining us if you're watching this on video after we've recorded it, then if you're interested in being a part of one of these fellowships, we'd love to have you. Go and visit us on the web at allegiancetotheking.org, allegiancetotheking.org. And you can contact us there. There's also a donate link there if you'd like to support what we're doing with Allegiance to the King. You can donate there. So we'd love to hear from you. You can find us on Facebook, on Allegiance to the King on Facebook, as well as Christian Virtual Fellowship on Facebook. And we love connecting. That's what this is all about, is connecting with biblical Unitarian believers around the world. We've got folks with us tonight from India, for example, from around the world, and connect together and have a place where we can have true fellowship. All right, so let's get into this tonight. I've been looking forward for a while to this teaching and to be able to share this. I think this little section certainly has blessed me, and I think it will bless you tonight as well. So let's get right into it. And we're going to look at Matthew 5:21 through 26 in the New American Standard is what I'm going to be reading from. And here's our passage. So let's read this. "You have heard that the ancients were told, 'You shall not commit murder, and whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court.' But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court, and whoever says to his brother, 'You good for nothing,' shall be guilty before the Supreme Court, and whoever says, 'You fool,' shall be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell. Therefore, if you are presenting your offering at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your offering there before the altar and go. First, be reconciled to your brother, and then come and present your offering. Make friends quickly with your opponent at law." Audio is not muted. "Make friends quickly with your opponent at law while you are with him on the way, so that your opponent may not hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the officer, and you be thrown into prison. Truly I say to you, you will not come out of there until you have paid up the last cent." All right, so this is our passage. The first question I want to ask is, okay, wait a minute. What kind of anger are we talking about here, Lord? Because, if me getting angry is the equivalent of murder, I know I'm doomed, and I suspect everyone else is as well, because I don't think you can go through life without being angry. But you know what? Even just, from a scriptural standpoint, well, that can't make sense. The Bible says, be angry, but do not sin, right? Okay, well then it's possible to be angry without sinning. So what kind of anger is Jesus talking about? Fortunately for all of us, Jesus did actually qualify what kind of anger he's talking about. So let's take a look at that. So, is he talking about anger at my spouse for leaving dirty dishes out? If he is, then Lisa is Lisa's going to hell because she gets angry at me for leaving dirty dishes out. Is he talking about anger at my child for disobeying me? Well, if you're a parent and this was true, well, then you're in trouble, because what parent does not get angry at their child for disobeying them? And what about anger at my boss? Because, he or she gave me a lousy assignment. I know I've been given lousy assignments before. I've had situations where my boss gave me an assignment that they knew would make me angry. And so that was no fun. And so is it that kind of anger? Well, okay, again, if you're employed at any point in your life, you've probably been angry at your boss at some point. Jesus is not talking about any of these kinds of angers. He's not talking about just any kind of anger. Let's look at what it says to begin with. He says, whoever says to his brother, you good for nothing, shall be guilty before the Supreme Court. And whoever says, you fool, shall be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell. All right, so he's given two qualifications here of what kind of anger is he talking about. And we see, somebody who says to his brother, you good for nothing, and somebody says, you fool, right? So what does that mean, right? Well, good for nothing is it comes from the Aramaic. It's actually transliterated into the Greek. It's raka. And this is an Aramaic term of abuse. It means, it's, good for nothing is probably about as, worthless, that kind of thing. But the idea is I'm going to say this in a very derogatory way. I'm not saying this, to necessarily try and help someone to see where they're wrong. No, I'm using this as a term of abuse. I might despise this person. I certainly think very, very little of them, that sort of thing. The second word, fool, this is the Greek word moros, and this is a term of reproach. It means idiot, right? Our word moron, comes from this word. And so it's, again, a derogatory term that I'm using of this person because I feel contempt for this person, right? That's the kind of anger that Jesus is talking about. That, this idea of good for nothing, a term of abuse, fool, a term of reproach, these are qualities of contempt. I remember studying a few years ago about marriage and that fighting and anger in marriage. And a lot of research has been done on that subject, on why is it that one couple can just fight all the time, but have a happy marriage that lasts year after year after year after year. And then you have another couple that they may not fight all the time, but man, the love is lost and they end up in divorce, right? And so, what happened between those? And so they studied couples, a number of studies have been done where they studied couples who fought, and they tried to determine what was the difference between couples who fought that lasted and couples who fought that ended their marriage. And the trend that they found was contempt, right? That if one or both of the spouses developed contempt for the other spouse, almost certainly that marriage was going to end in divorce. Whereas in a marriage where they get angry with each other, but they did not feel contempt for one another, that marriage was, the fighting in that marriage was not going to end that marriage. And so contempt is really this key ingredient. This is what Jesus is talking about. It's the kind of anger where you're not just mad at them because they did something stupid. You're not just mad at them because they did something to you that you didn't like. You're not just mad at them because of the circumstance of it, anything like that. It's you're mad at them in contempt. You feel contempt. You feel like this person is worthless. This person is not just a fool. I certainly have felt, I've been angry at people before that I felt was a fool, but not in a contemptuous way. I just felt like, why do they have to be that way? I wish they weren't that way. That's very different than this feeling of, I think so little of them that I think that they're worthless. Right? So contempt. Now, that's not the only thing that Jesus says about this anger that he's talking about. So we know now we're talking about contemptuous anger, but he also, as we're going to skip the middle part, the little middle section of our verses, where Jesus is going to give us kind of a practical example for us to think about of the point that he's making about this. When I get to that section, I want to talk about this whole section that we're in, but I want to get us to the point that he's making before I kind of open that concept up. So he also, at the end of this little section, he says, make friends quickly with your opponent at law while you are with him on the way, so that your opponent may not hand you over to the judge and the judge to the officer, and you be thrown into prison. Truly, I say to you, you will not come out of there until you have paid up the last cent. Now, for a long time, this little piece of this kind of confused me. I'm like, what? Why is he talking about this? He's just talked about anger, and then he talks about reconciling, and then he says, make friends quickly with your opponent at law while you are with him on the way. Okay, so I always related, okay, so I need to reconcile, with someone that I'm angry with, but that doesn't really fit with what Jesus is saying here, and it's not really what is happening. He's making a point about, again, the kind of anger that we're talking about, that this is the kind of anger that does not go away. When he says, truly I say to you, you will not come out of there until you've paid up the last cent. This person is angry with you at the point the anger is not going to go away. They're not going to let it go. They're going to take you to the judge. They're going to take you to the court. They're going to see through this anger of theirs to the end. They want you to pay every last cent of what you owe them in restitution because of their anger. So it's not just contemptuous anger. It's contemptuous anger that lasts, a lasting contemptuous anger, that this is not going to go away. They're not going to let it go. It's going to eat at them inside, right? So that's the kind of anger that we're talking about. They're going to require full retribution. They are not going to discontinue their anger on their own, a lasting anger. Or a good way to talk about this is resentment. A kind of resentment that, when we think about resentment, resentment has sort of built into the quality of the word that it lingers, right? If you say, so-and-so resents something, that's not a momentary passing. I could say they're angry about something, and we can all think about that in a way where, yeah, they were angry in the moment. Somebody cut me off in traffic and I was angry at them. If I say that, no one's going to think of that in terms of, oh, John was angry at that person from there on out, right? But, if you were abused by a family member as a child, frequently that, you grow up with resentment towards that family member, maybe a parent or something, that their resentment may be in your heart. Bitterness maybe in your bitterness is another way of thinking about this. So that's the kind of anger that Jesus is talking about. So when he says, you've heard it said, thou shalt not murder, and then he says, but I tell you, if you're angry with your brother, then essentially you're already guilty of that sin, right? He's going to qualify for us. He's not just talking about any kind of anger. The kind of anger that fits this this thing that he's talking about, this idea that you've already committed the sin of murder in your heart if you have this sort of lasting resentment and contempt for that person. But here's the interesting thing, right? Lasting contemptuous anger. Here's the interesting thing. In that middle section that we saw, Jesus tells us what to do about it, right? He's going to tell us, hey, you've heard it said this, but I tell you this. So let me give you an example of what to do about that. And, and I've always thought about it this way, that what Jesus was trying to tell us is you got to get rid of that anger out of your heart. Don't let that last. You're committing murder if you're allowing that anger to linger in your heart. And it's not that that's not true. That certainly is true. You should get rid of anger that lingers in your heart. It's that that's not what Jesus's example is talking about. Let me illustrate. Therefore, if you are presenting your offering at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your offering there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and present your offering. So we want to think carefully about what Jesus says here in his example, because this is his point that he's making. His point that he's making is actually encapsulated in this, this little example of how to walk this thing out, right? So first, note that Jesus has placed reconciling with your brother above religious activity. I think this is an important takeaway from this message, right? That the point that Jesus is making here, because it says, you know, you are coming to present your offering at the altar. That's a religious activity. And he's going to say, no, that's not the priority here. Reconciling with your brother is the priority, right? If you were to go back a little bit in the passage and where Jesus says, your righteousness needs to exceed that of the Pharisees, right? Well, okay. The Pharisees would see presenting your offering at the altar as righteousness, right? But Jesus is going to say, no. If you got this going on, you got to go reconcile. That's actually more important. That's a concept in there of your righteousness exceeding that of the Pharisees, because you're going to put this reconciling with your brother above religious activity. Okay, so that's something to note first off. But the second thing is to ask yourself the question, in Jesus's example, who is angry? You or your brother? Okay, now I've always read this until recent times, that I'm the one who's angry. If I'm presenting my offering at the altar, this is the way I've always read this in thought in my head. And there I remember that I've got something against my brother. I'm mad at my brother, right? That I need to leave my offering, go be reconciled with. That I read it that way. I've asked a bunch of people since I realized that's not what Jesus is saying. I've asked them this question: who's angry, you or your brother? And if you're watching this video and you answered that question in your head, I bet there's a good chance you said you, because every time I've asked it, people 100% of the time have said you, right? You are angry. But look at what he said. I'm not the one who's angry. You are presenting your offering at the altar, and there remember, oh, wait, the brother has something against me, right? So who's angry? The brother is angry. I'm not the one who's got this lasting contemptuous anger. They've got the lasting contemptuous anger. Jesus doesn't say, and there you remember you've got something against your brother. He says your brother has something against you. The brother is the one who's angry, which turns this whole thing on its head. Suddenly we have to take a step back and say, wait a minute. Jesus is not talking about that you need to get rid of that anger in your heart. You need to get rid of that contemptuous, lasting anger in your heart. That is not what Jesus is saying in this. Again, I'm not saying that's wrong. Obviously, you want to do that if you have that. That's not what he's saying. In fact, he's going to go on to say, because that person who has that is not going to let it go, right? At the end of this, he's going to say that. So Jesus is not primarily giving us a commandment to not be angry with our brother. Let that sink in for a minute. The point Jesus is making is not giving us a commandment about not being angry with our brother. That's certainly true, right? And Jesus would certainly say, yes, you should not have contemptuous anger for your brother. But that is not the point that he's making. It's not what he wants us to take away from this. He is teaching us how to be a kingdom person. He's teaching us to be a person who will sacrifice themselves to save their brother from death. Think about that for a minute. It says, if you remember your brother has something against you, so they have the contemptuous, lasting anger, and you remember, oh, wait, my brother is caught up in a sin that Jesus says will send them to hell, that they will die the second death, permanent death. They will not enter into the kingdom if they are guilty of this sin. that's what's going to happen to my brother. I need to set aside, first of all, my religious activity, right? Because what's going to happen to my brother is way more important than this religious activity I'm doing, right? And I need to go figure out whatever I need to do to go save my brother. Don't allow your brother to remain in that sin because of something between the two of you. Go to your brother and reconcile with them. And I'm going to expand that. You're not going to necessarily get this in this little piece, but you're going to see this in the whole Sermon on the Mount, that Jesus is making us think, give up your rights. Give up your rights. Saving your brother is more important than your rights, right? In this situation, it doesn't say whether what my brother has against me is legitimate or not. It just says that he's got something against me. Maybe it's totally illegitimate. And again, you won't necessarily see this in this section, but you're going to see it in a lot of others. And so the point comes back into this section that Jesus is saying, you need to sacrifice yourself. You know, he's going to go on later on in his ministry to say, I'm going to sacrifice myself for you. You've got to do the same for one another. Right? And this is a way that we do this. This is how we do this as kingdom people. We sacrifice for one another. One of the ways I sacrifice for my brother is don't let my brother go to hell because I didn't try to reconcile with them. Because they lived in contemptuous anger. Maybe I'm thinking, well, that's stupid of him or her because I didn't do anything wrong. And they shouldn't feel that way, and they're wrong for feeling that way. That's not the point that Jesus is making. Jesus doesn't make the point, well, okay, then you're right. No. He says, go try to save them. Go reconcile with them. Go figure out, is it possible for you to enter into that situation and change that dynamic, to rescue your brother from that sin? You're the only one who can do that, right? Because remember, in the next little piece here, he's going to say, that anger they're going to take you to court. It's going to last unless you settle with them. You're the one who can. Nobody else can settle with them. You can settle with them. So do it. That's the point that Jesus is making. Now, in looking at this is the whole idea, right? Is that this is our introduction where Jesus, he just got through saying, talking about salt and light. He got through talking about how your righteousness has to be, greater than the Pharisees if you want to enter the kingdom. He talked about, what are the characteristics of kingdom people? Those who mourn their sin, who hunger and thirst for righteousness, humble, all those things. Those are the characteristics of kingdom people. And so he's going to spend a lot of time then talking about how to be kingdom people. What does that look like? And he's going to go through a whole bunch of stuff for the next 2.5 chapters that help us to get that into our head of how we're to walk out this. What does that look like? And so here we have at the very beginning this, you've heard it said, shall not murder. But I'm telling you, if you have contemptuous anger for your brother, you've already committed that. So, kingdom people, if that brother has that against you, go reconcile with them. Go pull them out of that situation. That's what kingdom people do. They set aside themselves. They set aside their rights. They set aside whatever they need to in order to save their brother. If you think about Paul, when he's addressing the Corinthian church, and he tells them that he has set aside his right as an apostle, as a minister, living off the gospel. He set aside that right. He had the right as a minister serving them to receive from them material goods for him to live on. He had that right. He talks about it. Got that right. He set aside that right to save them so that there be no interference in their acceptance of the gospel and growth in the gospel. That's the concept, right? If my brother has something against me and maybe I'm feeling like, hey, that's his problem, not mine. Nope, that's not how we're to think about it. Setting ourselves aside, go save our brothers. Each of the examples that Jesus uses, I said 6, and now I'm suddenly thinking there's actually 7, but I don't know why. Each of the 6 examples Jesus uses illustrates sacrificial love. Now, there's a lot of other things that are going on in these examples, but it's important to note that one aspect is this idea of sacrificial love, right? That I have the kind of love where I will set aside my rights and I will sacrifice myself essentially for my brothers and sisters. And so what I want to do, again, I'm not saying that that's the only thing each of these examples are about. I don't want you to take that away, because there's a lot more. I mean, I showed you one for this, that Jesus makes the point that reconciling with your brother is more important than religious activity. That's another thing that you can take away from what Jesus is saying here. And so there's other things going on here that you could make, and I'm sure other teachers, as they come along and talk about these next things, they'll pull those things out. But what I want to pull out just very briefly for each of these things is to show this aspect and this theme that's going on throughout this section, and really the whole section of the Sermon on the Mount. So we saw the first one, sacrificing yourself for a brother or sister who is angry with you, right? That's one. We already talked about that one. The next one is sacrificing your eye and your hand, right? This is lust, right? So the idea is, if you have lust in your heart, he says, if you commit, you've heard it said, do not commit adultery, but I tell you, if you've, lusted after a woman in your heart, you've already committed adultery, right? That's the idea. And then he goes on to say, if your eye offends you, if your hand offends you, cut them off. In other words, cutting out of your life anything that causes you to sin. Sacrificing those things in my life that lead me to do that, right? Cut it out. Don't have that in your life. I'm going to sacrifice myself. This is the point, right? I'm sacrificing something in me. This is in a different way than the other one, but if you think about it, when I sacrifice myself for my brother who's angry, I'm sacrificing this idea that, well, maybe he's the one who's angry with me, right? But I didn't do anything. Obviously, if I did something, well, duh, I need to go apologize for it. But what if I didn't do anything? Well, Jesus' point stands. Go reconcile with them. Go figure out a way to reconcile with them, right? Go do whatever you need to do. Go reconcile with them. Go save them. And so I may have to set aside. I may have to sacrifice something that I feel, I want in order to do that. In this case, I'm sacrificing, lust. If something is causing me, whatever it is in my life that's causing me, I wouldn't be lusting after it if I didn't want it, right? So I got to sacrifice that aspect of myself in order to get rid of that. We see the next one about divorce, right? And Jesus is going to say, you've heard it said, about divorce, but I tell you that except in the case of sexual immorality, that if you divorce your spouse, in this case, especially in the culture that they were in, the husband divorces the wife, he forces her to commit adultery. In our culture, this would be true of either the wife or the husband. If the wife divorces the husband, she may, in fact, depending on the situation, cause him to have to commit adultery by remarrying somebody else. So in that particular one, sacrificing our right to divorce. There's a whole nother section. I won't pull it up here. You can look it up. I'm trying to remember where it is. I want to say it's Luke 19, something like that, where Jesus is asked the question about divorce, and he responds in the same kind of way. This idea that they said, is it true that Moses said, you can divorce for any reason, and And he responds that Moses only did that because of the hardness of your hearts. It wasn't that way from the beginning. God never had any intention for anybody to ever get divorced. And the only reason he allowed even the exception that Jesus is going to talk about right here, which is sexual infidelity, sexual immorality, the only reason he allowed that one is because of the hardness of your hearts. Think about that for a minute. This is what he's talking about here, sacrificing your right to divorce. You stick to it. You work through it. You sacrifice so that you're not going to cause your spouse to sin, right? That he didn't intend for us to do this. Now, later on, I'm going to actually teach on that section, and I'm going to go way more into that. So for purposes of this, just suffice to say, because every time I teach on divorce, usually there's somebody who's been divorced and they get upset. And, the reality is the Bible's very clear. It's sin, and Christians are not supposed to do it. 1 Corinthians 7, it's actually a commandment from the Lord for Christians not to divorce each other. And so if you are in that situation, if you're listening to this video and you're in that situation where you did divorce and remarry, and let's say it was your fault, you can actually be in that situation where it was not your fault. You were the spouse forced into that situation. But you wanted the divorce, you initiated the divorce, you were perfectly fine with the divorce, all that kind of stuff. That's sin. And like any other sin, you need to repent of that sin and truly repent and ask for forgiveness and don't do it again. So I will get more into that when we get there, but I want to make sure you hear that. Fourth thing, sacrificing whatever would cause you not to keep a promise. So this is vows, right? So we're going to get to the vows. And Jesus is going to basically say, don't make vows. I tell you've heard it say, keep your vows, right? And he's going to say, I'm telling you, don't make a vow. Make sure that your yes is always yes and your no is no. If you say yes to something, don't make a vow, just keep your yes. If you say no to something, keep your no. Right? That's essentially what's going on there. And so you think about this, if you say yes to something and then later on you don't really want to say yes to that anymore because it's inconvenient, because you didn't really know what you were getting into and stuff like that, Jesus is telling us, keep your yes, yes, and your no, no. Stick with it. Sacrifice that internal desire to reverse that situation, right? So again, this is going back to the overall picture of sacrifice that I'm trying to call out in each of these sections, that kingdom people sacrifice their rights. Kingdom people sacrifice their rights for righteousness' sake. That's probably the best way I can say it. Kingdom people sacrifice their rights for righteousness' sake. They look at the situation and they say, my brother's in trouble, I'm going to sacrifice my rights, whatever that means, in order to save them, in order to help them. Next one, sacrificing your right for vengeance, justice. Pretty straightforward. No, don't take vengeance. Instead, I'm not going to go into this one because I know when we get to this one, this one's really good. So I don't want to go deep, but the part about sacrificing is pretty obvious here, that if I am in a situation where rightfully I should get justice, right? That what they did to me was wrong. Jesus is telling me, nope, sacrifice that right. That's what kingdom people do, and turn around to save that person, to bring about righteousness in the situation as a whole, to help them. Kingdom people are lights on a hill, right? They're the salt of the earth. And they're the people who lead others to Christ, who lead people back to Christ if they've wandered away, right? And so we frequently, just like Jesus did, we're going to have to sacrifice ourselves to do that. And finally, sacrifice yourself even for those who are an enemy. I don't know. Even Jesus talked about, that people sometimes sacrifice themselves for a good person or for a friend or whatever, but who sacrifices themselves for an enemy, right? So, he's going to say that. And so this one's pretty obvious. If you're doing something good and loving, out of your way, giving to your enemy, you are certainly sacrificing in that situation. So this is what kingdom people are like. So this is the idea. This is the point that Jesus is making. This is the take-home message, is that Jesus is not really making a point about not having contemptuous anger. That is true. He's saying you don't want to be that way. But primarily he's making the point about what kingdom people do in a situation where somebody has that, right? Kingdom people, when someone has contemptuous anger towards them, they find a way to fix that. If it means giving up that right to being right, that's what they do, right? They go to that person, and I've had many a situation where I knew somebody was mad at me, and I felt like they didn't really have a right to be mad at me. I didn't do anything in that situation to warrant their anger. I felt that their anger was their own problem, their own emotion. It was coming from themselves, and it had nothing to do. There was nothing in my actions that dictated that anger. Certainly, if I feel like I did something wrong to somebody in a genuine way, I'm going to apologize to them as quickly as I can. Obvious. But I've had a number of situations in my life where that was not the situation. They were angry at me, and they had no reason or cause to be. It was in their own heart, their own emotions, their own way of thinking. And a fair judge in the situation would look at my actions. And I had this happen, here a couple of years ago with a situation with a previous ministry, where someone on the outside looking into the situation, who had a pretty intimate knowledge of the whole thing, looked at it and go, "No, you're right. You didn't do anything wrong." I still apologized. I still said, I'm just really sorry. I did not mean to, create this situation. And why did I do that? Because I wanted to bring them out of that. How do we get back on track together? Right? How do we reconcile and get back on track together? Well, they're mad at me. They don't really have a right to, but it is what it is. Okay, I'm going to sacrifice myself. I had a situation come up. I'm still trying to work through this in my business, where I found out there is a church in the area that was looking to do business with a company that we provide some software to. And so the elder board of this church got together to approve the contract with this other company. And during that meeting, they found out that they were doing business with us, that part of what they were going to do in this situation was the software that we provide to these folks. And one of the elders of this church became very agitated and was saying derogatory things about my company and would never do business with us, and that kind of thing. I have no idea who this person is. I have no idea why. It could be that they're just had a bad experience. It could be an ex-spouse, for all I know, of one of our employees. I have no idea. So I've been trying to work in that situation to find out who is this person. I'm kind of getting stonewalled on that, but hopefully I'll be able to break through that. My purpose is not to go tell this person they're full of it, they don't know what they're talking about, they're wrong. I have no intention of doing any of that. My purpose is to go find out, is that person feeling that way because of something that I myself have done? Because I want to apologize for it. Now, maybe it's something that I actually did and I don't even know that I need to apologize. Or maybe it's just something that was perceived and it's not real. It certainly wouldn't be fair to me. Doesn't matter. I'm going to go try to take that out of that person's heart in whatever way I can. And that is the point that Jesus is making. That is what a kingdom person does. So that's what we want to strive for, and that's what Jesus is trying to tell us. All right, so let's open it up. Let's see here. Stop the share. All right, go ahead, Dustin.
First of all, thanks for that. I think that's very timely, and I think that message is obviously it's been true for 2,000 years, but I think that's something that people can come back and watch a year down the line, 3 years down the line, 10 years down the line, and it'll still be applicable. I don't think that's going to change in our society. I just kind of want to piggyback off some of the things you said and add two small things. When I look at this commandment, I see Jesus reminding us of something that I think we still need to hear, which is that we can't just interpret the teachings of Jesus as individuals, because what he's saying about if you hear that your brother has something against you, you need to go deal with that. He's trying to remind us that that Jesus' teachings are not just directed to us as individuals, they're directed to us as a community of Christ followers. And it's still hard for us to do this because, especially over here in the West, we are targeted as individuals. We think as individuals. We think about our individual experience. What is in it for me? And it's very easy for us to view Christianity and religion and even our place in the church as an individual. And Jesus is trying to really get us to see that we have a relationship to our brothers, to other people in the body of Christ, and we need to start thinking that way. And that's not our default for a lot of us, because our culture has ingrained in us that we're individuals. But he's saying, no, you have a responsibility to your brother has a responsibility to you, and we need to repent from not thinking that way. So that's something that's very interesting. It's part of the loving your neighbor as yourself. Who is your neighbor in that instance? It's the believing brother. Okay. So
before you get to your second point, just to say something, the little image that I had in the back, kind of faded in the background, was Cain getting ready to smash a rock on Abel's head, and when after that event occurred, when God asks Cain, where's your brother, and he says, am I my brother's keeper, right? And the answer for Christians is yes, right? We are our brother's keeper. We have a responsibility to one another, to help each other, we are bound together, right? And no different than a husband and wife is bound together and has vowed together. This, going back to whatever month or two ago, when we did the teaching on water baptism, that ceremony of water baptism is a commitment between the person and the body of believers to one another, right? That part of what that is about, that water baptism is about, that makes it actually different than the baptism of the Spirit, which is a little bit different kind of thing going on there. That ceremony it's like a marriage ceremony, of an exchange of vows. I am vowing to the community my allegiance to the Lord and to them, and the community is accepting me in. This is why the commandment, Matthew 28:19, is not to the person who's getting baptized. It's the person who's baptizing.
Yep.
That's who is actually being commanded. Because the point is that the body must accept the person in. This is the struggle that the early Jewish Christians had with Gentile Christians of actually accepting them in. It's why Peter gets in trouble after Cornelius when he goes back to Jerusalem, and they're giving him a hard time because he baptized them. He accepted them in. Because once they're accepted in, we have that kind of marriage vow commitment and responsibility to one another. All right, sorry, Dustin, go ahead.
Sure. No, and I appreciate that. That's good clarifying things. The other thing I want to point out is that what Jesus is saying is kind of a response to, you've heard it said, you should murder. And then he says, actually, you're not supposed to even get angry. That is, we need to, I don't know who started this or where it all came from, but we need to stop reading that as if Jesus is giving us this brand new commandment, as if that's something that was never said in the Old Testament. the verb that's used there, or yizome, is definitely a wrathful type of anger. And so I just while you were going through this, I went and I looked up every single occurrence in the Old Testament, and every single time that someone other than God uses it, God uses it a lot, and God has the right to do that, because God is the judge. But whenever a human being uses it, they're always in the wrong. They're never praised for doing that. They're never held as a righteous example. Every single human who does that is wrong or disobedient in the eyes of God. So when Jesus says, hey, don't murder somebody, but actually I'm saying don't even get angry, that is not a new teaching. That has always been the heart of God, okay? And the thing is, I think one of the things that Jesus is doing with these teachings is that, it's possible to obey the commandment to not murder somebody, by the letter, okay, but completely miss the point of what God has always intended. And what God always intended was don't even get angry to the point to where it even get to that murder, okay? And so if we just say, well, I'm really angry with somebody, but I never killed him, you've missed the point completely. And that particular point is not a new teaching with Jesus. That was a point that was already there in the Old Testament. And Jesus is reminding us as the mediator of the new covenant that this was always the intention of God. So anyway, that's my 2 cents.
Good. It's good stuff. Dean's got his hand up.
Well, when you were talking about, I forget how to phrase this, but at the beginning, talking about calling your brother a fool and stuff like that, and the word that came to my mind was finality. In other words, you continue with that, and you phrased it somewhat different, but it meant the same thing. Finality, the finality. He's a fool. I won't have anything to do with him, and stuff like that. And that's what came to my mind. And then I posted some things along the way while you were teaching.
Yeah, it is.
Finality means everlasting. That's it. You're trash. I don't want nothing to do with you, and stuff like that. And it's a final, unending anger.
Yeah, I like the way you just put that. You're trash. I want nothing more to do with you. That is definitely the kind of thinking that Jesus is talking about.
Well, and I put it in the word that came to me was finality.
Yeah, and that last piece there, that's really kind of what he's talking about, is that kind of finality, that this person is not going to let this go, right? That's the point where they're going to require every last cent to be paid, right? That, they're looking for the, full retribution, and they're not going to let it go. And so, yeah, finality is a good word.
The way I have to look at that is how much has God forgiven me, and that's been amazing. And so I think when you realize how much God has forgiven you, then you got to back off. Really, you got to back off, and you got to apply some mercy and stuff like this, no matter who it is. May not be your best friend, perhaps, but you got to back off.
Yeah. We certainly, you can see by the example the real point that Jesus is getting to, but in the midst of making that real point, he certainly is saying the clarification that Dustin talked about. This has always been God's heart on this matter. We need, as kingdom people, not to be this way. Those things are absolutely true, that, we need to have the humility in our own hearts to recognize that we are just as sinful. When you think about the parable of the unforgiving servant, for example, God, the king forgives the servant of this huge debt, and then the servant turns around to this other servant, and he's going to require every penny of that. He's going to, he sells him and his family off to pay the debt and slavery, instead of doing the thing God just did for him, right? of letting that go, letting go of that requirement of retribution. And so,
Yeah, if you're going to act like a Pharisee and that you're so righteous in what you believe and how you live, then you're not going to make it very well. If you recognize that you, again, you know, that you've sinned a lot, then you can empathize with other people, and you can, I think it's a lot easier when you get your mind right, your heart right, to go back and help that person because you know where you've been at.
Yeah.
So I've said enough.
Anybody else? Thoughts, questions? I don't know if there's.
John, I have a comment.
Yes, Rudy.
In 1 John 4:20, where it says, if a man say, I love God and hate his brother, he's a liar, for he that loves not his brother whom he has seen, how can he love God whom he has not seen? I think that would go with this verse, which we shared today, where you leave your sacrifice to God, and first you go and make sure that you don't have anything. You try to reconcile with your brother first. So I think it's saying the same thing, that we first have to make sure we have love for our brother and people, and then we can say that we also have love for God.
Yeah, I would say it's within the scope of the same topics. Certainly, it's kind of, it's the opposite side of that coin. So in Matthew 5, Jesus is saying, okay, here's the standard. Here's the standard of you don't want to have contemptuous anger towards your brother. That's wrong, right? And you're guilty of that same sin of murder if you have that. And then he's going to make the point. So if you have a brother who's in that situation, go get him out of that situation. Go pull him out of that situation, right? In 1 John, it's the flip side of that coin, where this person is saying that they love God, but they hate their brother. It's in that same, if they hate their brother, they're committing this same sin, right? And so they can't love God if they're doing that. And what I would say, Jesus is, in that situation, certainly that's the situation that person is in. They can't love God in that situation. They're a liar. That's not true. They don't love God. Jesus says, if you don't love one another, in the Gospel of John, if you don't love one another, you don't love him and you don't love God. And so yeah, absolutely. That idea that in fact, I think you could probably take what is said there in 1 John back into Matthew and plug it in there to Jesus's first statement, that this is the sin. If you hate your brother, right, then you've got that kind of anger, then you can't love God. In fact, you're guilty of murder. You're the worst kind of sinner. And so, yeah, there's probably a number of places like that, Rudy.
Yeah, I got you. So it is a little different in this case, where your brother is actually hating you, right? That's what it's a little different. Yeah.
But it's in that same topic, right? It's the same topic.
Right.
Yeah. Let's see if there's anything in the chat. Dustin, I don't know if you saw anything in the chat that.
Nothing really that needed to be commented on. So a lot of good points.
Let's see. I did have one question that somebody sent to me privately. Says, who is the brother referring to? Anyone, including enemies? That's a good question. I would certainly say it would certainly definitely include other Christians, without any doubt. So certainly that. In including your enemies, I think it would, because of what Jesus is going to go on to say, that if you hate your enemy, if you have contemptuous anger for your enemy, well, I think based upon what he says, you're kind of guilty of the same thing, right? That the idea is, even if they're not your brother in Christ, that we're commanded to love our enemies. And so, he's going to say in the last one, you've heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, pray for those who persecute you. Love your enemies, right? And so, yeah, I would say it does apply to your enemies would be included in the concept, certainly. Let's see.
Can I just gently push back on that? I'm not entirely convinced that Jesus.
You don't agree with that?
Well, I do think that he, since he goes out of his way to use the word brother, and Matthew's gospel makes a point of redefining what a brother actually is. Who are the mothers and brothers? Who's the true family of God? It's not those that are ethnically related to you. It's whoever does the will of my Father who is in heaven. He is my brother and sister and mother. And so I think interpreting that with the way Matthew uses that word very specifically, I do think he's limiting that, because I don't think Jesus expects you to go and to reconcile with your enemy, to every single enemy. That's unrealistic, and you don't see any evidence of the early Christians.
No, I'm not saying that. I see what you're saying now. I'm not saying that Jesus is telling you that you need to go be reconciled with your enemy who has contempt for you.
Okay, because the point is he uses the word brother there twice, very specifically. I think that this is meant to be an inter-community relationship, okay? Although not murdering obviously goes for a body, but you're not to get angry with your brother,
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm
Okay.
saying that in the sense of being the one who's got the contemptuous anger. Are you committing the sin if you have contemptuous anger towards your enemy, right? And looking at the last example, I'm going to say, I'm not going to say 100% that, you're definitely doing the same thing, but I can see that being related. That's what I'm talking about, not the reconciling part. So are you, in other words, are you doing what Jesus says not to do if you are doing that towards your enemy, not just your brother, but your enemy? And since he's going to go on to say, I don't want you to hate your enemy, I want you to love your enemy, right? I want you to pray for your enemy. Then I would say, okay, at minimum, Jesus is going to say it's wrong to have contemptuous anger towards your enemy, right? And potentially, you might be committing that same sin if that's what you're doing. That's what I'm saying, not the reconcile part. I would agree with you. I don't think Jesus is requiring us to go and be reconciled to any enemy that has contemptuous anger towards us. I think he's saying you have a responsibility to do that to your brother that's in that situation. Anybody else? I didn't see anything else in the chat list. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end the recording. For those of you who are watching on video, we'd love to fellowship with you if you'd like to be a part of this. Again, find us on allegiancetotheking.org, and we've got a number of fellowships throughout the week, and so pretty flexible in terms of different times and things like that, and time zones. And we'd really, if you're feeling isolated, if you feel you don't have fellowship, you're a biblical Unitarian and you don't have a place to go, that's what this is for. We want you to be part of our family.
Hey, if Lisa's still up, ask her